The cliche goes, right, that games tying into movies suck balls, and overwhelmingly the evidence seems that yes, that is indeed the case. So often producers will look for the cheapest development house who can offer the quickest product from start to shelf. The window in which a lot of movies are culturally relevant is kind of time sensitive, I suppose. Quality of the game be damned, you gotta capture that zeitgeist and get that $40 advertisement on the shelves, crank those sweet royalty checks, you know? Or sometimes the license gets shoehorned onto something else that really doesn't make sense. That doesn't always mean a bad game, of course, but it can make for a weird one. If we're actually thinking about it, you need to balance how close to the original storyline you stick, keeping in mind that not every great movie even makes sense as a video game. So we can excuse a certain amount of, well, I don't remember that from the film, as long as it still feels on brand and natural. Ultimately though, that's less of an issue than just making something that's playable. More often than not, that ain't the case. Here, however, I reckon I've found 10 Game Boy movie tie-ins that are actually pretty good video games as well, in no particular order today. If you've got any others, please share with the class. Dragonheart. Dragonheart for Game Boy, and the movie while we're talking about it, definitely comes under the header of hidden gem. Even though I'm not super keen on that description, I do have to admit it fits sometimes. The film with Sean Connery and Dennis Quaid is a charming little 90s fantasy thing about the last dragon and his alliance with a knight to overthrow a tyrannical overlord. The Game Boy game has a feel of some first-person RPG, but it's really more of a point-and-click adventure title with some basic combat sequences and puzzle elements. Fantastic graphical design here, and unlike anything else on the system. Universal Soldier. We talked about this the other week a little bit, but yeah, it's a good movie. Well, alright, it's a silly movie, but I liked it, and that's not the list anyway, Roger Ebert. The game is great though. The two things might not make any sense mashed together. The game is based on Turrican 2, which is a sci-fi run-and-gunner, but the movie, which is a sort of Earth-based sci-fi rather than on an alien planet, and not at all similar storyline-wise, was stitched onto the game quite late in development. It's even weirder when you consider the demographics of the Game Boy audience on one hand and Jean-Claude Van Damme fans on the other. Not sure how much of an intersection there is on that particular Venn diagram, but hey, I could be wrong. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Sadly, no Bryan Adams in this one. The star-studded, but ultimately quite dark, depressing, and actually kinda joyless take on the classic English folk hero story was not really for me anyway. I prefer the Keira Knightley one. A lot of people loved it though, seeing as how it was the second highest grossing film of 1991, second in fact to another movie on this list. I actually can't wait to show you my review of this 1993 Game Boy game, as it's such a varied adventure title, chock full of different gameplay styles. There's overworld fighting, side-on stuff, multiple character battles, and some really cool puzzly bits. It's not much talked about as a game, unfortunately, possibly due to the stigma of being attached to a movie, possibly due to the NES game, maybe even because it came out at a similar time to Link's Awakening, and so would have been completely swamped beneath the tidal wave of advertising that came with that game. Still, please do check this one out if you like what you see here. I promise this one's good. You know, I'm actually so proud of myself for scouring this library and managing to actually find 10 good movie tie-ins. Don't ever tell me I don't work hard for you guys. I mean, everything I do it for you. RoboCop. A fabulous soundtrack, as I've praised before, but as it happens, the gameplay is great fun too. Nothing super flashy or inventive as such, just a good old side-scrolling platform shooter, but in late 1990 when this came out, the Game Boy didn't really have much of this style that was any good. The level designs are varied and challenging enough to sustain your attention, and the shooting system is versatile enough to replicate RoboCop's sharpshooter thing. Way better than the second one, which saw the protagonist only able to shoot horizontally forward and jumping all over the place. You know, like how he didn't in the movie. Number 2 was trash bags. This first one, though, is a blast. Ghostbusters 2. Another really early one from 1990 here. Game libraries of the 80s gave us some great toss linking in with this movie franchise, especially in North America, with miserable NES and Atari titles making fans question whether they actually liked the films. This Game Boy one is not the one that's also Garfield Labyrinth or Mickey Mouse 4, which was a kind of crazy castle thing, but better. It's basically the same game as the PAL version of NES, Ghostbusters 2, the actually good one. You take your two busting dudes, one with with the proton beam thing and the other with the vacuum cleaner. Okay, so I haven't seen the film since I was about 8, and have to wander around these haunted buildings, actually sucking up ghosties through levels that actually pretty faithfully follow the plot. None of that daft driving around town and running out of fuel thing that the NES game did. The Lost World: Jurassic Park. There were 3 Jurassic Park games on Game Boy, with the most famous one, i.e. the first one, actually being the only one I wouldn't wholeheartedly recommend to you. Part 2 and The Lost World are both very well executed games, and I'd suggest either, or both. The reason this one's on the list rather than Part 2 is that this one is the one that's actually based from a movie. Ocean's 1994 release is not canon as such. Movement here is great, and the vibe of exploration you get here is much more satisfying than the plodding clunkiness of the first game. True Lies. The film that confirmed Jamie Lee Curtis as #1 sex symbol, you know the scene I'm talking about, in a film that also starred Tia Carrere, is another one of those crazy 90s action hero, blow everything up and murder like 300 people basically on your own and come out of it still getting the girl, you know the ones, right? This one is Arnie rather than Jean-Claude, and gave us a rather great top-down shooter actually. Varied levels that accurately follow the plot of the movie, sadly omitting the bit where he was on horseback on top of a skyscraper being chased by bikers. Tons of really satisfying blasting action, and you get to kill the first boss in a public bathroom. What's not to love? A real highlight of the late Game Boy era. Hudson Hawk. This, however, is a stupid, silly, and kinda insane film. The game's still pretty good fun though. I've already reviewed it on the channel fairly recently, and while it didn't break the top 20 list from 1991, it was a lot closer to that one than the shit list from last week, let me tell you. Some awkward platforming here and there doesn't take too much away from the experience. I'd almost suggest not to watch the film, as the game doesn't really resemble it in any way. That's probably why the game's actually decent. I mean, Andy McDowell was clearly plastered throughout filming this, that's how bad the script is. Oh yeah, I really like the graphical details in this one too. Terminator 2: Judgment Day. The actual top-grossing film in 1991, it did like $500 million, was arguably the peak of Arnie's career, and boy howdy did it spawn a bunch of games. The Game Boy one is stunning to look at, and audibly as well. Gameplay is definitely firmly on the difficult side, which was more than likely to cover up the shortage of actual levels, but once you get into it and learn not to muck about and just get on with it, it's very playable. You won't win on your first playthrough, probably won't win on your 10th playthrough. Hey, play it for the presentation alone if you want, but if you can get over how bloody hard it is, there's also an enjoyable game in there. Alien 3. The same combination of Bit Studios and LJN as the previous entry, Terminator 2. See, LJN really aren't as bad as all that, especially not on a system plagued with tier text titles. Notice how, despite making many movie tie-ins, they don't have any entries on this list. This one's cool for featuring one of the only examples on the system, maybe the only one, I'd have to check that, of a global timer. So yeah, you get something like 2 hours to finish the whole game, else the whole prison facility you're in gets vaporized. Also, there are other scripted events that occur at various other points in time. Very cool, and that's without playing the game itself. It's almost a survival horror game. You're definitely being hunted here, and the game lets you know that. And it's not just the timer, the other humans you see running around are actually finite as well. The more that get eaten, the fewer actually remain. They don't just respawn indefinitely. Eventually, there'll be no one else left to save. Whew, some chilling stuff here, and the graphics and sound add so much to the foreboding atmosphere as well. Goosebumps, man. And that's our list. See, told you it was possible. Did you have any other movie tie-ins that you actually liked on Game Boy? Let us all know in the comments if you wouldn't mind. Hopefully this list has gone some way to give some balance to the cliche that movies always produce rubbish video games. Look, don't get me wrong, I'm certainly not trying to dispel the notion by any means. 80% of them are trash, and believe me, we're gonna explore exactly that next Friday. Ooh, there's some stinkers on that list, believe that. Anyway, enjoy your weekend, I'm off to watch Dragonheart, yay!